Thank you, folks. I'll let you catch your breath, but as the credits roll, please, this is a film that requires a conversation, and I'm proud to do this today with Rabbi Amichai Lau-Lavie. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start this off with a quick, amongst the many brilliant things that Gidi Dar, the director, shared with us while he was here during his screenings. One of the things he said about this film was that he could have given this a happy ending. He could have given us a moment where Yavne is started and the whole Talmud era begins to blossom, but he very purposely did not. He didn't want to tell an audience. He's making this film to make a statement to the audience. And he very much did not want to say, wait, this could lead to a good thing. I would love your reflections on the messages of this film. We could talk about, of course, we're on Tisha B'Av right now. We could talk about its historical accuracy, but I think, as we mentioned earlier, talking about what the message just needs to bring to the audience right now. And I'd love your connections.
There we go. Yeah, I first saw this film a few years ago when it came out in Hebrew in Israel. Not on Tisha B'Av, but during the 9 days. I think this was 3 or 4 years ago when the film came out, maybe a little more. And I did not remember the end. As I was watching it this time, of course, it's a little different in English, and it's different right now. I was startled that the end is hallelujah, and it fades into smoke. And I, too, remembered in my imagination that it ends with Ben Zakkai starting the next phase of post-destruction. But on some level, that is wishful thinking. Watching this today, watching this in 2024, I know Gidi fairly well and spoke to him before today among so many other screenings is happening around the world. His intention was and is to wake us up to what I believe was not always what Tisha B'Av was focused on. I can speak for myself as somebody who grew up in Israel in a religious setting. Tisha B'Av was, and I believe it is in many settings here in the States, about trauma. It is about the memory of our sorrow, and this film shows so much of that. What I do not remember being taught, and Gidi remembers not being taught, is how we got to the trauma and what we can do to prevent the next trauma, not just for us, but for all. And what is so haunting in watching this film this year is realizing that we centered and prioritized our pain and what happened on Tisha B'Av, but we did not center and prioritize the internal struggles that made it easy for Rome to do what empires do and dismantle what was already falling apart. So what Gidi was trying to do, and I believe is hopefully trying to wake more of us up to, is what happens when the scholars are silent in the face of greed. What happens when zealots take over the religious enterprise? And what happens when brothers treat brothers as others and prioritize power over love? And can we stop it as it is happening right now again? I think that's Gidi's question. I think it's up to us to figure out how we're answering it.
It's devastating. It's devastating to watch this destruction and to see those similarities. The polarization that exists, the fractions that exist, and how fractured it made society, and how of course the corruption too. I mean, I think this is also one of the many statements is a statement against the corrupt government. There's one direct shout out that I pick up on, which is they run off to Caesarea, which to me that. There might be some political reference there for those familiar of where the Prime Minister of Israel may or may not have a home.
Look, I don't want to get political. I don't know who's in this room, and we don't need any more hardship. I want to hold with you all, first of all, the pain of what we just witnessed. And yes, the uncanny political contemporary references. The pain of watching what I as a child read in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, in the Book of Legends. As a child, on the afternoon of Tisha B'Av, my older brother Benny took me aside to the backyard and read to me some of the legends of Tisha B'Av. And again, what we centered was what happened, not how we got there. But I want to hold with you all the fact that what we're dealing with is a national calamity that is still impacting the national conflict of right now, including some of what we're seeing in this film, the religious divides, the eventual bureaucracy and corruption that can be what happens with religion. Something that is in the film that I'm sure many of you will go and Google and search is the Queen of Judea, Berenike, who's a fascinating and complex character, who did have an affair with Titus, who did try and defend Jerusalem, who played this role of both and, of standing up for her people and being one of the empire, of not wanting Jerusalem to become the domain of the zealots and the fundamentalists and trying to save it. They wanted Jerusalem to surrender, to offer peace at the price of independence and nationalism, but the nationalist narrative won. Missing from this film, and that was a choice of the director and the amazing crew that very wisely put a lot of information into this, is a fascinating character that isn't very well known. His name was Tiberius Alexander, who was an Egyptian Jew, one of the highest ranking generals in the Roman army, and the commander of Titus. Vespasian made Tiberius Alexander the commander of Titus, and it was assumed that as a Jew he would spare the temple. But Tiberius Alexander was also a Roman, and he was a Roman first. And so there's fascinating research about what it was like to be on the one hand with the people of Jerusalem, but against the zealots of Jerusalem, and how to put perhaps the interests of empire or peace eventually as it comes face to face with what militants do. So there are so many layers, and I think in the years since this film was made and how it is played out right now, again, we're seeing many, many haunting similarities. And what I'm hoping is that more people are looking at and saying, how can we prevent what happened then? And what is the responsibility of each one of us in New York, in Jerusalem, whatever political take we're on, however we are hurting, to learn from history so we don't perpetuate history.
And before we take some questions and comments from the audience, what are your thoughts of how do we do that? What is there a magic recipe? You have and I'll share from mine. I feel that the divisiveness that exists that we see in this film, that we see portrayed in this film, is something that is really present, by the way, not just in Israel, obviously, today. I feel here in America, too. That polarization, the everybody else is wrong, the fake news, whatever it is of each side not being, each side others the other instead of listening to the other. And I feel like that's something that we need to get better at.
I have my views, and I won't share them all. I don't want to position my political position at this point as an Israeli American, as somebody who deeply believes there is a way out of the current conflict, and there was a way out of that conflict that would have prevented a lot of blood and would have prevented the destruction of Jerusalem at the price to hubris and at a price to some faith and fear-fueled fury. I believe there is the path of peace. And Ben Zakkai was one of the speakers for a path of peace at the price, at a high price, that was paid anyway. So yes, you're right. If we could, Darchei Shalom, right, walk the paths of peace, and remember to Darchei Noam, that the Torah doesn't teach us to be this violent for the sake of perpetuating, let's say, the temple, then we will take a step back and reimagine what is the greater good. And this will be more of a chess match than a checkers game. And I also want to say that I was not in the shoes of the Judeans under Roman Empire. And that to be under empire demands resistance, whatever empire is. And so how do we find the sweet spot between resistance to empire and between resistance to evil in its many faces and prioritizing humanity and humanism, which I do believe is at the core of the Torah. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love the other as you love yourself, requires a big game. And I'm not sure that's the game that some of my fellow Jewish rabbis, activists, politicians, and well-meaning defenders of Israel are playing. And I am aware of the fact that just today, Itamar Ben-Gvir walked on Temple Mount to challenge the status quo on the same holy place. And I believe his motives. And I even respect them. But I don't accept them because I'm aware of the larger context. And how does peace and the well-being of all people, how does it have to come first? And so we have a lot of housekeeping to take care of and a lot of education. And I know that people are watching this film with very different takes than mine. It is popular in Israel both by people who justify the zealots and people who vilify the zealots. And I think that's part of the power of art, for us to ask tough questions and to figure out our own dialogue towards resolution.
Thank you. We have a microphone, and we will pass that. Please try to keep your, I know there's a lot to say, please try to keep your responses short and kind of in the form of a question.
First of all, thank you. First of all, thank you and congratulations on a truly extraordinary achievement. My question is about the ending. Did you consider filming a final scene of Yochanan ben Zakkai teaching Torah in Yavne? And if so, why did you end up not choosing that ending?
So, although he's very familiar with the film, Amichai is not the director of the film. And I did start off by saying that, yes, this is Gidi Dar, the director of the film, did talk about considering giving it a little bit of a happy ending, ending on a higher note, but very specifically chose not to because he did not want to. He was looking to make a statement to our audience and to make sure that that didn't get lost with some false hope. I saw another hand up over here. Oh, nope, she's taking it to the top, sorry.
One thing that it's very close to me. One thing that struck me in this film was a turning point of something that tends to get pushed out in the rage and the anger and the fire, and that is grief. There's a point when the protagonist is grieving his mother, and it's a turning point for him. And I'm wondering how we can give greater primacy to the work of grief, right? A lot of people show up for the fire and the earthquake and the hurricane, and how can we bring in the still small voice when it's seen as so unsexy?
Well, I think one of the things we're learning also is that if you are, I'll speak for my lifetime, and Regina, you speak for yours, that Tisha B'Av really has been about grief on one level, but really about blame and pain and what happened, what did they do to us, and a lot of the Holocaust was brought into Tisha B'Av with real trauma. We're still in response to that trauma and all the others before it. I think giving room to grief requires a tiny bit of distance. In the same way, we need to ask the question, how did we get there? How did Jerusalem fall? And the Talmud and Josephus describe it in detail. Just like we need to ask those hard questions historically and politically, we can then make the space for the grief that allow us to not just think it, but feel it. And I agree, that scene in the movie where he's in grief for his mother shows him as a real human being who was hurt and got angry and was pushed out by Ben Zakkai from the Beit Midrash, who internalized his faith in a way that he truly lived up to till the very end of Kiddush Hashem. He sanctified his life for the God he believed was important. And so it's on us to understand that grief too. And if we met each other in the grief, not in the rage, not in the righteousness, maybe we can find the humanity forward together.
We had a question right here in the middle.
Here you go.
Let's pass you the microphone.
Sorry. Amazing film, and I'm not sure you have the answer to this question since you didn't create the movie, but maybe you heard the director speak. And where did he come up for the concept of the graphics, and who created the graphics to the movie?
So I know a little bit. The graphics were made by the folks that made Waltz with Bashir, if you've seen that film. Of course, a very different style. I love it personally that he uses a very traditional style of art to kind of reflect a little bit, I think, of classical Christian art, if you think about that, and makes, I think, that connection's there. I mean, it is, we could spend hours just analyzing the art here. David Darcy, who's an art critic, actually wrote a whole piece specifically on the art of this film and what went into it, of course. And it's really thousands of masterpieces being created, each one actually drawn. Of course, to make it animated, there were some budgetary questions. I'll be cynical for a moment. And, to make a full animated film requires a much larger budget. And this was one way to do it, but it was also an artistic decision. And there was that decision of there have been other films. This is not the first to be made with still frames and to tell a story with still frames and to make it resonate. And that's a little bit of a challenge. Gidi is a very aware filmmaker. He pointed out during the conversation the one real animated moment. There's a few moments, but there's one that stands out as an animated moment in the film. Is anybody remember? The horse. And the horse being the first film ever made was the image of the horse that they brought together, and the statement of this being really how people reacted when they saw that first horse move, and to remind people also that they're watching a movie. And I think there's something Brechtian there a little bit too, of waking an audience up.
Can you
We'll take one last question.
Gentleman right over there.
I guess my for final question is, could you argue that God is a part of this story? Because from a philosophical perspective, he really seems absent for the most part. At times, it feels like people are trying to justify a bad thing as part of God's plan, even if to some extent it works in the long run. Because we're all like wishing for that epilogue sequence where we see them beginning the teachings of Judaism again. But would you say that God is a part of this, or is people wanting God to be a part of the story?
Okay, go to the rabbi.
Yep.
With your permission, that is a big theological question of what we call theodicy, the questions of not knowing about God's presence. I just want to say that in this film, the moment that I think captures the human break is when the smoke is no longer on the altar. Imagine that for hundreds of years, thousands really, with some interruption, for Jews, the pillar of smoke that vertically connects earth and heaven is the presence of God. It means the altar is working, the kitchen light is on, mom is in the house, everything's okay. The moment when that smoke pillar ends and you see the queen and you see everyone horrified, that is the visual depiction of the death of God. Is that the death of God? No. That is the ritual, sensory, artistic depiction of a major moment of transition, a paradigm shift. What is the divine and how the divine persists through the worst and best moments? That's for another conversation. But this film captures was one of the most difficult mythic moments in our history.
And I'll just add that that there's discussion about the temples, both temples being destroyed. Sometimes some say that the first was because of the sins of the people to God, and that the second was the sins of people to their fellow man. And I think this film really focuses on that relationship, and again, puts the burden on us and how we treat our fellow man. Amichai, thank you so much for being here. Folks, this is how I love doing Tisha B'Av. This is how I love doing Yom Kippur. We love watching films as a meaningful experience that connects to our Jewish roots and holidays. Thank you so much for joining us, and join us for more. Thank you.